This is chapter 25, part 2. We're going to cover a lot of ground here in the second part of the chapter as we study the second half of the 19th century all across Europe. It's going to go country by country, and we're going to give you just a brief overview of what are the major developments in each nation between about 1850 and 1900. So buckle up, we're going to go fast. We're going to start in Russia. At this point, 1850, Russia is already a large multi-ethnic empire that's been ruled by the Romanov family for several hundred years now as an autocracy. Remember that? Rule by one, divine right. And the country has never modernized yet up until this point. They've been backward, they've been oppressive and repressive, and serfdom is still alive and well. And they've had Peter the Great experimented with some minor reforms, so did Catherine the Great, but for the most part the country is still almost in the Middle Ages. And they are resistant to modernization until this point. They also oppose any form of nationalism among all the minority groups that live in the empire. No surprise there. So again, before 1850, backwardness, lots of serfdom, exploitation, brutality, going back centuries. Turning point, 1853, the Crimean War. This is a complicated war, don't worry about it. It was fought between Russia and several other powers in Europe and in the Middle East. And they lost. The Russians lost this war. They thought they'd win, and it revealed how backwards and behind they really were. Finally, it got the attention of the political and military leadership that said, we need to change society. We just got worked over. So it promoted a massive period of reform. Get that written down. And the Tsar at the time, who realized this, at least 2 years later, was Alexander II. He is a much-loved Tsar by most people because he did something really dramatic. In 1861, he freed the serfs. He basically ended slavery in Russia among the peasantry. And corresponding to that year 1861 is the Civil War in America, which is also, in part, ultimately about slavery. So this is happening on opposite sides of the world, though, same time. He reformed society a little bit politically through this what's called the Zemstvo. He created them. They're like local councils, local governments of each town. They did not exist before. All government came from the Tsar, from the top down. And he allowed some form of limited democracy at the local level by creating a type of structure where people could have some input on their society. There was some legal reforms. They had independent courts for the first time where they weren't totally controlled by the Tsar. And in theory, they had this equality before the law enacted. So this is radical stuff for the people of Russia. This guy's reforming the political system of society. Economically, in Part C, they started industrializing. And it begins right around 1860. And the government is going to pay for it with initial success, just like in the rest of Europe. Not waiting for private industry. Government leads. But the problem is Alexander II got assassinated in 1881 by a fanatic, kind of random. He was taken out and he was replaced by, and here's a picture of it, I think somebody threw a bomb in his carriage and it blew up, and it was a really, really awful way to go. So this is the end of the good Tsar, and instead it's replaced with his son, Alexander III. Not so great of a Tsar. Look at the difference between their pictures. You know, he's got his little puppy at his feet. This guy looks like he's going to kill somebody, okay? So this guy stops all the political reforms. He says, the people did this to my father. They couldn't handle their freedom, essentially. Look what happens when we liberalize. It leads to murder. So he cancels all the political progress, for the most part, but continues the economic stuff. So it's full speed ahead economically only. And he hired a finance minister named Sergei Witte, who's going to be the architect of the Russian Industrial Revolution. And he's going to finance it and figure out how to do it and get help from the rest of the world. And one of the first things they do is they build a railroad all across Russia, from Moscow to the very east, almost in Asia, called the city is Vladivostok. And the railroad is the Trans-Siberian Railroad. It goes all the way across Siberia. And for the first time in its history, Russia has a link between its westernmost point and its easternmost point. And now they can start to build and centralize and build up a real nation. Here's a picture of one of the bridges of the Trans-Siberian Railway. And this is the station, I believe, in Moscow, where you board that trip to go. It takes something like 10 days by train to go from one side of the country to the other. It's huge. Okay? Second thing they're going to do is pass high tariffs. So we got to keep out the rest of the world's goods. Tariffs are taxes on imports. Raise them so that we have to buy Russian goods only. And then the next thing, we're going to use the West to catch up with the West. They're always behind. Remember, that's a theme of Russian history. We've got to catch up. So they're going to bring in, as Peter the Great did, Westerners, encourage Westerners to come and work in Russia, pay them a good wage, teach us how to build factories, teach us how to run businesses, because they don't know. So they're going to use the West to catch up with the West, and involved heavy foreign investment, heavy foreign presence of workers, because they didn't have the skills from within. Fast forward 1905, this process has been going for several decades at this point, and Russia's got a little bit of confidence now, and they start to try to take colonies. This is what a thing to do in the late 19th century, is get yourself a colony. They tried to take Korea, and they bumped into Japan, who was trying to do the same thing. And there was a huge war called the Russo-Japanese War, and Japan just completely destroyed the Russians. Another wake-up call for the Russians. They've lost 2 huge wars now, but they've industrialized in the middle, and they still lost. So what does this do? This starts to create political unrest among the society. Our government is inept. It's incompetent. We can't win a war. We can't win a battle. And the Japanese sunk something like almost the entire fleet of the Russian Navy in just a day during this battle on the east, over here on the very east side of the nation, over by Japan. There was a battle over there, and almost the entire Russian Navy was destroyed. So that, again, they thought they'd made progress, but not enough. And here's a kind of a crude cartoon of the Japanese just taking out the Russians. So it's going to create unrest, and it's going to increase nationalism and a spirit of rebellion, really, among lots of people in Russia. To the point that in 1905, here's another cartoon, by the way, of the Russians about to collapse. The society has industrialized economically, but politically, they're still backwards. The new czar in 1905 is Nicholas II. He's the last czar of Russia ever. He's not going to make it very long, but he had a chance right here to do something good. There was a huge protest in 1905 at his house, the Winter Palace. It was peaceful. The people asked for basic rights, basic freedoms. It was led by a priest named Father Gapone. And on Bloody Sunday in 1905, Tsar Nicholas orders his troops to fire on the crowd. At least that's what the crowd thought, because they started getting shot by the Russian army. And it was a bloodbath. Many protesters died, and there becomes a massive spirit of anger, mayhem. People stop working, they go on strike, and it's a revolution against the Tsar. He wouldn't modernize. So the Tsar responded by promising them the October Manifesto, which said, we'll create a parliament called the Duma, D-U-M-A, and we'll give you basic civil liberties. And we'll even pass a new constitution called the Fundamental Laws. But then in reality, the Tsar is still going to control everything. He's going to have a veto power over everything. He says we'll have universal male suffrage, but really not so much. So this is sort of a promise that he doesn't keep. Middle-class liberals thought that Russia was going in the wrong direction, of course. Russia's backward. They need to catch up. We need a progressive czar, and we don't have it. The Tsar repeatedly dismissed the Duma that he had created. When they disagreed with him, he just said, go away, and he would install new ones loyal to himself. So the main point here is that Russia promised change after much war and after much rebellion. They really don't do it. They're slow to change, and they're going to get taken out. The whole Romanov dynasty and Russia is going to be overthrown in World War I by the communists. Let's move forward. It's time for the responsive national state. This is what's happening in the rest of Europe between 1871 and 1914. There are now large nation states on the map that didn't used to be there, Germany, Italy, and others that have been there forever. And this is the age of what we call mass politics, where there's an increase in the number of people participating in society and in government. And it's in these 5 or 6 large empires across Europe. The age of mass politics. Over the period of this period, universal male suffrage becomes the norm. Men acquire the right to vote. This creates loyalty to nations. Governments are trying to secure the loyalty of the citizens toward them. As you see now in certain parts of Europe, there's different rebellions continuing to happen. The women's suffrage movement gains strength at this point. Lots of political activity, got it, among the masses. There's large multi-party systems, where it's different political parties that are now on the scene competing for your votes and your attention. And what you have is these, they would temporarily work together in what we call coalitions when they were elected to get anything done. There's always more political parties in Europe than there are in America. We usually have two. There's like 8, 9 parties in each country in Europe. Starts in the late 19th century. A larger role for national governments. Governments start to take care of people in what we call the social welfare state. The government takes care of you from cradle to grave. When you're in trouble, the government's there to help out. When you're sick, there's health care. When you're old, there's Social Security. When you're unemployed, you get a benefit. You get some benefits, some unemployment money. Got it? Governments take on more and more role than ever before. This is the end of laissez-faire, free market capitalism approach in Europe, and it's moving towards socialism a little bit. Here are some of the negative things going on in the late 19th century. Governments are manipulating people. In the public opinion, they're manipulating people. They're starting wars and using crises to divert attention away from real problems. They're taking colonies all over the world. And then there's, as we'll see at the end, rising extremism and anti-Semitism. So lots going on as an introduction here. Let's go into the German Empire. This is the brand new empire that was created in 1871 through Bismarck and the conservatives. It's huge. It's the most powerful nation in Europe immediately at this point. Economically, militarily, they are the dominant form. It's a union of 25 different states, kind of like a U.S. type model. It's continuing to be led by Chancellor Bismarck, who used to be prime minister. Now he's the term chancellor. And they also in Germany have this thing called the Reichstag, which is the name of their parliament. Okay? And they're dominated, as they always were, by liberals. So the word for Germany is going to be secularization and centralization. That's kind of the dominant theme. Write those words down. And the first thing they do is they've got to get rid of the Catholic Church's dominance in Germany. So Bismarck wages what's known as the Kulturkampf, culture wars. And it's really an attack on the privileges and the power and dominance of the Catholic Church in the new Germany. And Germany was this is a new nation, so they're kind of having to sort out separation of church and state. And most Germans particularly in the South, were Catholic. And he goes, we have to have loyalty to the new Germany. You can't have your loyalties to the Pope anymore. So he wages war on their privileges, their legal status, and all that. This is just what's been happening all over Europe in the last several hundred years. Remember, the French revolutionaries did the same thing. So now the Germans are doing it. And there was some resistance among a lot of the German people, so he kind of backed off a little bit at the end. But for the most part, this leads to the separation of church and state in Germany. And there's Bismarck and the Pope in this political game of some sort of chess, sort of a funny cartoon. So economically, they're starting to grow their businesses in Germany. And they're growing their rivalries as well. When you grow your businesses, you're going to start to have economic enemies, particularly the Germans and the French. The Germans put up very high tariffs so that no one can buy anyone else's stuff except Germans. So this is not free trade. This is making their neighbors upset because no one will trade with them. So they're starting to get building some enemies right away. Politically, Bismarck said, no socialism. I don't believe in the socialist movement. He's a conservative. And he goes, you can't be a socialist. That's a threat to our nation. It's a threat to the loyalty of the people. And so the movement of socialism in the new Germany goes underground, which means they have to go into hiding. But what Bismarck does brilliantly is he said, everything that the socialists want, for the most part, I'm going to give the people of Germany. Not because he believed in them fundamentally, but because he knew that if he did it, it would create loyalty to him. So he created the first ever social security system, which was when you get old, the government gives you money. Pensions in your retirement. You work all your life, you get a paycheck for the rest of your life from the government. He even experimented with some early forms of government health care. He needed the support of the workers who would have been socialists, but he says you can't be socialist. He's outlawed that. So let me, Bismarck, the great politician, give you what you're asking for anyway, and in turn you'll support the new Germany. It's brilliant. He didn't believe in Social Security really. He didn't believe in all this stuff fundamentally, but he knew it's what people needed to have. Here it is, a little cartoon too, just how it works, sort of silly. You can look at that for a moment. All right, Bismarck, his career comes to an end when a new Kaiser comes on the scene. This is the son of Kaiser William I. Maybe it's a grandson, I don't know. But he's a new leader of Germany, and he's a young man. He's like 29 years old when he gets the throne. The previous kings of Germany, the first one, was an old man who let Bismarck do whatever he wanted. The new guy comes on the scene and says, I'm the new face of Germany. I don't need Bismarck anymore. He's too powerful, and he dismissed him. He fired him. And this new Kaiser is named William II. He's relatively unstable, emotional, egotistical. He has all kinds of personal problems and insecurities, and he's really not fit for leadership. So he reverses Bismarck's policy toward the socialists, which means he legalized the Socialist Party as opposed to, like what Bismarck did, provide everything that socialists wanted but keep it illegal. He fired Bismarck, which is in this famous scene, they call it dropping the pilot. Like you kicked the pilot off the ship. The only person that knew where anyone was going is now gone. And there's Bismarck being fired just simply because he didn't want a power struggle with this new leader versus the old leader. So people say this is the beginning of World War I right here, when the great statesman Otto von Bismarck is fired by this young emperor who really doesn't know what's what. So right away, because he legalized the socialist movement, this German Socialist Party, called the Social Democratic Party, starts to rise, and it becomes, by 1912, the largest political party in Germany. Bismarck was literally rolling over in his grave at this point, saying, I kept these people at bay through all this political maneuvering, and you've legalized it, and they're about to overthrow you. And they're building the Marxist movement now legally in Germany. So this is what's happening in Germany. The Bismarck stuff was good. The Kaiser comes in, starts to deteriorate. Let's go on to France. Republican France. This is also known as the Third Republic. This picks up right after 1871 with the Franco-Prussian War. Napoleon III was captured and removed and sent into exile. And what happens in Paris is a several-month rebellion called the Paris Commune, led by communists, socialists, who are using war as an excuse to try to have another revolution, but this time in the name of socialism. Remember, they didn't get what they wanted in 1848. They're going to give it another shot now, but not being allied with the liberals. This is just students and socialists and angry workers. And they put barricades up in the absence of a real leader, and there's this chaotic anarchist period for several months in the early part of 1871. And of course, like most rebellions, it ends with the rebels crushed. The conservative National Assembly rallied, got themselves together, elected a president in the name of Adolf Thiers, and he turns the army on these communist kids and slaughters more than 20,000 in the streets of Paris. It's a civil war in Paris. It lasts a few months, and the leaders are destroyed. And to this day, if you're a socialist or a leftist, they remember this with a bitter passion. To remember the memory of the communards. They call them the communards, the guys that led this. So that's the end of that. We move into what's called the Third Republic, led by a Republican president named Adolf Thiers. This is now the end of French monarchy. You'll never have a king again. And France, the word for the column here is modernization and stabilization. France is going to become a very modern nation at this point. They're going to legalize unions and give workers rights. They're going to become, again, very modern. They're going to build up a colonial empire and start taking colonies around the world. They're going to have free public education now. Instead of Catholic religious education, the government is going to create public schools. Sounds very modern, very secular. And we're going to replace, again, Catholic schools with government-run schools. And we're going to use all this to create loyalty, patriotism, republicanism to the next generation. So this is the way they're going to modernize in France. Economically, a little bit politically, educationally, we have all that happening. All right, let's move on. One of the things happening in late 19th century France that's really important is this issue called the Dreyfus Affair. This is a major event in which a Jewish army officer named Alfred Dreyfus was accused of treason. They said he is passing secrets to our great enemies, the Germans. And they put him on trial, convicted him, sent him into to prison on like a remote island in Central America. And they put him on a boat and took him far, far away. And years later, new evidence came out that said that Dreyfus maybe wasn't guilty and that maybe he's been the victim of scapegoating, or because of his religion, because of his Jewish faith. And this, he's brought back and given a second trial in France for the same thing, where all this new evidence comes out. It splits the nation into two, between people that supported Dreyfus, which are pretty much like the liberals, the intellectuals, the kind of the progressives, forward thinkers, writers, people like the realist writers are on his side and defending him. And then on the other side is the army, the government, and the Catholic Church, all of whom continue to say this guy is guilty, even though the evidence was very clear that he wasn't. It revealed an incredible amount of anti-Semitism in France at the turn of the century. People, they didn't know it was there, but all of a sudden it's like sort of an OJ trial type thing. Everyone takes a side, and you have all these issues come out that no one really knew was there. And so French society and French politics are kind of split down the middle. Eventually what happens is Dreyfus was cleared. His name was cleared, but only after he'd been in jail for something like 15 years. And he had been in like solitary confinement. So the poor guy, eventually got his dignity back, but it took a long time, and it almost tore the French society apart. Sounds very modern. Extreme political views leading to a lot of hostility in the nation. Ultimately, this led to in some cases, very appropriate separation of church and state in France, where the government and the church just really part ways, and France becomes very secular and not particularly religious at this point forward, because the Catholic Church was on the wrong side of this. They were against Dreyfus, and they were completely wrong in that. It turns out this guy was totally innocent. They eventually caught the guy that really did pass the secrets to Germany, and he was just sort of let go with it with not much of an issue. So it was a really, really tragic event in France. Okay, let's move on to England. There's a picture of Dreyfus, by the way, an older guy. Okay, in England, the key word here is democratization. Over the course of the late 19th century in England, the governments of England give the people of England the right to vote. Starting in 1832, they gave it a little bit more. It's a transition to democracy. Then John Stuart Mill, a famous author, wrote a book on liberty in which he said this is the great struggle of our era. Political rights for all is what it's all about. He's sort of like, he's sort of updating the views of John Locke, but to include all men now. So John Locke, remember, said that property-owning men ought to vote. Well, Mill says it's the right of all, God-given right of all of mankind. So amazingly, it's piecemeal. It goes little by little. In 1867, one of the British prime ministers named Disraeli gave all middle-class men the right to vote, and he called it the leap in the dark. We don't even know the outcome. It's a risk giving even just all middle-class men the right to vote. But he said we have to do it to keep relevant, to stay popular. It's just like Bismarck in Germany. They got to do things to stay important and stay in office. So they start giving people the right to vote. By 1884, they're almost there with the Reform Bill, almost at full male suffrage, and now we have the beginning of the social welfare state in England, where the government is going to take care of you from cradle to grave. They pass the people's budgets, which raise taxes on, you guessed it, the rich, to pay for programs that benefit all of society. This, of course, is now the definition of what it means to be a liberal. So it sort of shifts. We don't, by liberal at this point, we don't mean free market capitalism, we mean modern-day liberals, where the government plays a large role, tax the rich to take care of society, raise taxes on the rich. And this is led by the Liberal Party the leader is named David Lloyd George. Okay. Lastly, on the British calendar here, there's this issue in Ireland. It's been hated forever. The Irish and English hate each other for centuries. Why don't we just let them go? Give them an independent nation. This was a home rule idea introduced by this guy Gladstone, another prime minister at the time. And there's a split in Ireland, actually. Not everyone wants to be free. The Irish Catholics, which is in the south, they want independence and to be a republic, but the northern part of Ireland were Protestant, very friendly with England, and they said we want to stay with England. So there wasn't universal agreement even among Irish people. So they just sort of postponed the issue until after World War I. And it's not going to get resolved real pretty, but that's another issue on their plate. Here's what's going on in the Austrian Empire, going into Eastern Europe. The country is disintegrating. There's too many ethnic groups. Look at this. They even tried to create a dual monarchy called Austria and Hungary, where there's like half and half to try to appease those Hungarians that were so mad. That doesn't work. It's an ethnic stew. Look at the groups. Look at the empire. There's no way this thing's going to hold on. Everyone wants independence from somebody else, and unlike in the rest of Europe, nationalism is going to end up destroying the Austrian Empire. The word is disintegration. over the 50 years, 1848 to 1914, and the Austrian Empire, the Habsburgs that we've been looking at since day one, won't make it through World War I. Next, Jewish emancipation and modern anti-Semitism. So this is a big thing in turn-of-the-century Europe. It's been in the past, it was in the Black Plague, you've seen it flare up at times, but it really starts to grow around turn of the century. A lot of Jews had entered the middle class at this point. There was a lot of prosperity. Think back even to Spain with the New Christians. The Jews had acquired wealth and privilege and some degree of political influence, and all of a sudden there's this new backlash against them. The people had been in law, retail, finance, railroads, journalism, all kind of professions now. And after about 1875 or so, anti-Semitism becomes on the rise. People resented what they believed to be Jewish financial control over the finances of Europe. There was issues like the Dreyfus Affair, where it really inflamed people, and they thought the guy was a traitor, even though he wasn't. And then there were politicians that were really espousing this. This guy named Karl Lueger was the mayor of Vienna, and he was a strong anti-Semite. In fact, young Adolf Hitler grew up in Vienna hearing this guy talk, and this was widely believed to influence Hitler. So what do you have now in Europe? There's a reaction against all this anti-Semitism, and it's called Zionism, the belief and the movement for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. It starts right here by a man named Theodor Herzl. We have to get the Jews out of Europe. Look at how unwelcome we are. Look at the Dreyfus Affair. Look at these mayors. We're not welcome here. We need to go back to our homeland from biblical days in Palestine. And he starts a political movement called Zionism to try to build a broad international movement to try to rescue the Jews from another wave of persecution. In Eastern Europe, the persecution is particularly bad. There's these things called pogroms under the czars in Russia, which are organized campaigns of violence almost on the scale of a mini Holocaust happening. And so in Russia, it's terrible. People either have to leave or for the most part, they're rounded up and killed. So it's almost a precursor, again, to what's coming in World War II. All right, last section, Marxism and the socialist movement. Oh, by the way, here's a map of Palestine. This is what they wanted. We want these areas around Jerusalem. And, guess what? They've been fighting over this ever since. All right, last bit, Marxism and the socialist movement. So Marxism is growing in Europe in the years before World War I, especially in Germany, Russia, and France. Karl Marx tried to put together an international organization of socialists in the whole world called the First International and the Second International. They were going to be like giant conventions of communists. And he said, remember, we don't want to reform the society. We want to overthrow it and start new ones. So he tries to get these big meetings together, and typically in Europe, they would gather, but they really didn't build much steam. They would vote on some things. They'd have some celebrations or protests, like on May 1st. They call it May Day. But it never really happened here. The way Marx dreamed of this worldwide revolution, and he wrote about it in his book, Kapital, it never panned out and played out the way he wanted. Here's the way it did play out. Socialism became less radical over time, more of a distinct belief. Remember, there was Marxism radically, socialism sort of in the middle. Socialism is the one that gets the attention. More people become socialists, but they become more interested in gradual change. They start working within the systems that they have because places like England and Germany are giving the workers what they want. So maybe there's no need to be a radical communist in early modern Europe here. Workers gain the right to strike. They gain the right to negotiate, what we call collective bargaining. We're going to get to that in a minute. And for the most part, people's standard of living rises after 1850. So there's not a lot of motivation to launch a revolution if your life's getting a little bit better. Now, remember, early efforts at labor unions in England were crushed with the Combination Acts, but then they were legalized by 1824. So now you can be in a union. This is what you want. And they call them the new model unions. They work within the system for gradual change. And they're not as radical, they're not violent like Marx said they would be. So by 1912, Germany was the most unionized and socialist nation. Remember that? Because they're now legalized. So Germany is the place to be if you're a worker. You get lots of government help and you can be a socialist. Okay? Workers also gain the right to vote. Put that up there with the right to strike, the right to vote. And the last thing they get is they get to have collective bargaining, which means you get to negotiate as a group. for wages. The government or the employer has to work with you. So we call all this revisionism. People want to update socialist views by working within the system instead of calling for radical revolution. It was sort of hit the refresh button on Marx is out, socialism is in. And so the leaders are listed there, Bernstein, Charez, and socialism is very different. It's not one thing like Marx said it would be. The workers of the world rising up as one. He goes, it's not really happening here. Now, some places, and like in Russia, it's really radical and they're going to have a real revolution, but in other places in Western Europe, Germany, England, it's just a political party. So it turns out Marx wasn't exactly right. What he predicted wasn't really going to happen, and instead the revisionists, they're going to revise the socialist movement. They're going to work within what they've got for gradual change. And that's the update. That's the late 19th century across Europe, the age of mass politics.